All right, welcome back to the Inexperienced Development Podcast. Today I have HeartBeast or HeartBeast, YouTube HeartBeast. Ben, he's got many names, all similar. How you doing, Ben?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So you're working on Demonlocke right now. That's kind of your personal project. Can you introduce yourself and kind of explain what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I am HeartBeast, like you said. I've been doing tutorial videos on YouTube for 6 years now, I think, and making small games on the side as kind of a hobby. And I recently started working on a game that I'm calling Demonlocke. It's a tactical turn-based RPG inspired by the Pokemon games, and I'm trying to take some design decisions that pull me away from those a little bit to try and change some of the things that I didn't like about the Pokemon games. But that's what I'm working on right now, and yeah, pretty excited for it.
So what? So I did see it. It looks a lot like Pokemon, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think draw from what like the classics is always a good thing. How is yours? How is your game different from Pokemon? Like you said, you're changing a little bit. How is it different?
Yeah, so there's graphically it looks very similar, like you said, and I will say that is temporary. I'm going to be changing a lot of the graphics in the overworld. Most of what we have right now are placeholder, and so it will look a lot less like Pokemon, the finished game will, because right now it looks very similar. Mechanically speaking, it's different in quite a few ways. The the game is designed to take out a lot of the grind that was in the original Pokemon games. That's something that I didn't necessarily like. I'm trying to streamline the battles too, so they don't take quite as long. And I've put the trainer in the battles as well. Since it's a game about summoning demons, you play as a summoner, and your character will be a part of battles as well. And your demons are kind of like the shield that you put up to defend you from the other demons. And so you kind of play a support role in battle, while the demon kind of plays a tank role in battle.
That's pretty interesting. So you're casting spells or what have you, whatever, and then your demon is kind of just like taking the hits. So can you fight without a demon? Basically, if your demon dies, can you still fight?
Yes, you can fight without a demon, although at that point you're in a pretty bad spot as far as the game goes if you've gone that far, because if your demons die, you can replace them. Kind of. It does take some work to replace them. Losing a demon is going to be a pretty big loss in the game. But once you die, the game is over, and they can't. Enemy demons and enemy summoners can't actually target you while you have a demon out on the field. It really does kind of create a barrier between you and the enemies.
Oh wow! So there's no like respawning. Basically, it's reset the entire game if you lose.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
yeah. Once your character dies, the game's over. You have to start over.
Well, that's intense. That's pretty cool. How did I'm familiar with like you wanted to create a game in like 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, but how did you get started on Demonlocke?
Yeah, so my brother and I were just walking around one day having a conversation, and I'd always wanted to make a Pokemon game, and we were like, okay, let's make a Pokemon game, but like change 2 things. Like let's straight up copy Pokemon. That was our original idea, just as kind of like a joke, and see what we could do in a very short amount of time, like 2 months, both working on it together. And so we did that, and we made the Demonlocke Alpha, which was very similar to Pokemon if you go play that. And we had a lot of fun with it, and the feedback that we got on it, I think it took us about, our goal was to do it in 2 months. I think it took us about 10 weeks. So a little longer than 2 months, but I was pretty happy that we were able to get that much done in such a short amount of time. I mean, it has a full soundtrack and stuff.
That's pretty cool.
And so, yeah, that's kind of how it got started. But the feedback that people gave, they were pretty excited about it. They liked the fast-paced battles, the animations that we'd done. You know, we kept getting jokes from people saying it took Pokemon years to add animations. You guys did it in 10 weeks. Of course, it's not a fair comparison, but you know, people did enjoy the experience that we made, and I think there was something there that was that was kind of special. So we're trying to keep that original core that was good about the alpha, and then improve it and change it so it's not so similar to Pokemon.
Right. So when it comes to roles, right, you did it with your brother, so it's basically a team at that point. How did you kind of segment and divide up who does what?
That's a really good question. My brother is pretty experienced with composing music, and he did the soundtrack. Outside of that, he doesn't have a lot of experience with game development, so we had to kind of try and give him roles that he would have to learn. And I have experience with the programming and doing the artwork and game design. He has some experience with game design as well. He actually did the soundtrack for my first commercial game, which was End Hall, and I actually talked with him quite a bit on the design too. We had design discussions about that game, so he did have some experience there. So he was able to support me and help me in that area. We kind of assigned him to do marketing stuff and also project management. So he managed the Trello board and tried to organize things there and figure out a good way to do that. I think that fit his personality pretty well. He's kind of a orderly person, likes to be organized, and so he kind of took on that role. I think, and it worked out pretty well. He still obviously was learning and was new to it, but that was fine. It was still extremely helpful to have another person working with me and helping me on the game, as opposed to just doing it by myself, which is what I was used to.
Right. And then the exhaustion that comes from like doing it by yourself and then getting kind of lost in like, for me, I like to be organized, but I have trouble organizing, right? Like Trello boards, I love to use them, but at the end of the day, it's kind of difficult for me to decide how small to break down a feature, and I end up finding myself kind of overwhelmed. So I feel like it's good that you had someone like that literally focused on organizing and breaking down structures and kind of telling you, what to do and not what to do, but like kind of separating and segmenting things. I think if I had something like that, that would be invaluable. That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's like it's always just like one more thing, right? Like even if it's not that hard to do it, it's just one more thing on top of everything else you're doing. And like we were doing the devlogs for it every week too, and so he was able to help with video editing. He started learning some video editing and was able to help there some. And like I did some video editing too. It was a combination where we were both kind of doing it, but just having another person to do some stuff, and he seemed to enjoy it as well. Like I think he had a lot of fun with it.
So yeah, and so you've been making games for like 7 years, 6 years, at least YouTube wise. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is 6 years old, or I think around 6 years old. I've been making games for quite a bit longer than that.
So did you start in Game Maker?
Yes, I started with Game Maker 5, or might have been 4, either 4 or 5. If it was 4, they came out with 5 pretty soon after.
Right, and so I'm not really familiar with Game Maker. I mean, I see a lot of people use it. Is that coding intensive, or is it kind of more plug and play, node based kind of things?
It has two options for building your game logic. Basically, you have a scripting language called GML, Game Maker language, and then you have their drag and drop kind of like, they're like little blocks that you can drag into specific events and create logic that way. When I originally started, I was using drag and drop, but it didn't take me too long to realize that was going to be limiting in what I was going to be able to do and manage code-wise, because it's just harder to manage your code when it's a bunch of little blocks like that. So I started learning how to use a scripting language pretty quickly, and then kind of stuck with that.
Right, and then it seems like even I use Unity, and even when you want to use the visual scripting there, a lot of custom things need kind of more complicated workarounds as opposed to just writing a simple script. So I could see how that would be an issue.
Yeah, you would get, for basic logic, it was really convenient to use the drag and drop stuff, but then as stuff got more and more complicated, you know, the drag and drop, you basically had to write code, but with these blocks, and it
Right.
was just almost more work than just writing the code.
Right. And then, I mean, learning code after like the initial shock is not really as difficult as it seems.
Yeah, yeah. And for me too, it was helpful to be like, okay, well, this line in code represents this drag and drop thing. I was almost translating between the two, and that was helpful for me as more of a visual person. I feel like I'm not a programmer by nature. I'm a programmer by necessity. I'm an artist by nature, and since I want to make games, I had to learn how to program.
See, that's really interesting. I think a lot of the artists that end up learning programming make some pretty amazing games because they have that visual fundamental skill. Like the programmers that want to make games but don't really know art yet have a little bit of a learning curve because you have to not only have your logical brain, which is what you're used to programming, but then you have to kind of activate that creative part of your brain as well. So it's just a little hurdle.
Yeah.
So how did you move from Godot, or why did you pick Godot after you kind of moved to another engine?
That's a good question. I get asked that a lot, and it's a complicated question because, I mean, the simple answer is just that I started using Godot and enjoyed it, so I moved over. The complicated answer is that I was never really a fan of Game Maker Studio 2's workspaces. When they came out with a new update to Game Maker Studio 2, there was a lot of things about it that I liked, and the irony is that the things that I liked about the new one made it so that I couldn't stand using the old Game Maker anymore. But there were things that I disliked about the new one that made it so that I didn't want to use it either. So it kind of put me in this awkward place where I just didn't enjoy using the new one or the one that I was used to. And because of that, I started looking into other engines, and I had some students. I had a student in particular that took one of my Game Maker courses, but did it all using Godot.
Wow.
And so he translated everything over, and the screenshots that he sent me of the engine got me interested. And I think I'd tried Godot in the past, but originally thought that you were forced to use C++ in it, like from their website, and like I downloaded one of their demos, but didn't really the platform physics. It was a platform game, but it felt super floaty and terrible. And I was like, this engine can't make good games. This feels terrible.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really fair of me to judge the engine by their demo, especially for like when it's like an open source project, but that's what I did. So, but because the student did it and he made the exact same game, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. He made the same game that I made. It functionally was the same. So I gave it a try again and kind of started using it on the side, and just sort of fell in love with the engine. I really like how the scripting language is pretty easy to pick up. It didn't take me long to learn how to use a scripting language. The engine is really lightweight. It does pixel art games in 2D really well, and those were kind of like top priorities for me. Where Unity and Unreal Engine, they can do 2D, but they were really originally designed for 3D, and then kind of 2D was added on top. With Godot, it felt to me like the engine was made for 2D, and they're adding 3D on top of that.
Right, and I actually agree with you. I think 3D is much more useful in Unity, and I mean, I don't know about Godot, but it just from like the kind of what I see, I don't really see that many 3D games in Godot. How is it difficult, or does it get processor intensive? Why is it not useful for 3D?
So I wouldn't say that it's not useful for 3D. I would just say that it's behind Unity and Unreal Engine in a lot of ways. Usability is probably the biggest one. Like Unity, the workflows for getting your 3D models and stuff into Unity feel a lot easier to me. And I should add the caveat here that I am not experienced in 3D, and so my judgment here is going to be a little bit skewed, but just kind of hearsay, the general vibe that I get from other developers and stuff is that it's just not quite as easy to the workflow to go from here's my 3D model to here's my 3D model inside of Godot with the lighting and everything isn't quite there yet. Although from what I've seen, it looks like Godot 4 is going to be improving that significantly. I think we're going to see a lot more 3D games in Godot. And there already are some 3D games that are being made in Godot. I mean, like Mrs. is making a game that's in 3D, and it's looking pretty awesome. And then there's some on the Godot website too, and kind of their featured list where they've got some good-looking 3D games there. So you can do it, and it's probably easier than doing it in GameMaker, but maybe it would be a little easier to do it in Unity. That's the vibe that I get.
Right. What scripting language does Godot use?
It uses a GD script. It's a language based off of Python, and it's syntax-wise very similar to Python. There are some differences in the way that you define stuff, but it's easy to pick up. It has optional typing, which I think is kind of nice. And it's not a fully fleshed out language. It is a scripting language, but I think that the features that it does have make it really easy to just start programming some logic really quick. And if you need anything faster, you can use C++ for, if there's some bottleneck in your code, you can convert that to C++ to get the speed you need out of it.
So what do you mean by optional typing?
So scripting language can have a lot of programming languages will have typing where you have to set the type that a variable is, right?
Okay.
So if you want an int, then like a number variable, then you would set it to be an int.
Like a declaration kind of, yeah.
Yeah, with a declaration. Scripting languages a lot of the time will make it so that you don't have to type stuff. And Godot GDScript does that as well, but they added an optional typing so that you can type stuff and it will help you catch errors. So in my own projects, I type everything. I add the typing to the scripting so that it can help me catch errors earlier.
Yeah, I feel like if you don't do that, you're kind of confusing. You might end up confusing yourself, especially with like when you have 300 lines of code and 100 different variables, very similar names.
Yeah, it definitely helps a lot. And then Godot, like the compiler itself, can catch stuff early. Like, oh, you're passing in an int here, but you're supposed to be passing in a string, and it will catch that error before you even run your game. Whereas if you weren't using typing, you might not even. It might be an error that you don't know exactly where it is. You might just have something not work right in your game, and you have to try and track it down and figure out where the data went wrong. And so it can help with stuff like that.
Do you use a specific IDE, or it looked like Godot has kind of like an IDE built in?
Yes, it has an IDE built in, which ironically was made using its own UI nodes and stuff, and that's kind of cool to me. You can use other IDEs for your script, for your writing your scripts, like VS Code and stuff, and they have plugins to try and help support that. I haven't really messed around with that yet. Maybe one day I will switch over, but for the most part, I like kind of the all-in-one aspect of Godot where I can just do everything inside of it. The one thing that I kind of have to do outside of it is making sprites. That is something that I miss from GameMaker. GameMaker had a sprite editor built into it, and in Godot, I have to use an external sprite editor. But outside of that, it's nice to have it all in one place for me.
And so you make all the art for all your games?
Yes. Yes, I do.
That's pretty cool.
I do enjoy pixel art quite a bit, and it's probably one of my favorite forms of art. I don't know what my original. I like I said, I was an artist by nature. I did a lot of art in high school and stuff, and since I started making games, I sort of transitioned into pixel art, and I don't really draw a lot outside of doing pixel art anymore, but I do enjoy it a lot. It's kind of like painting without the mess. That's what it feels like to me.
Some of the ones that you make, like I saw some of those trees and everything, the shading on those is pretty great. And so what I'm wondering is, did you like find a tutor or a tutorial in order to start it, or you kind of just like winged it?
For pixel art, I would say I've seen some tutorials and stuff over the years, but I think most of it was just kind of winging it. Since I already had the basic foundation of, lighting and shapes and values and edges and colors from my experience doing art outside of pixel art. I was able to kind of figure out how to transition to pixel art. There was definitely some differences that I had to get used to, but I feel like I just sort of felt my way through it until I figured it out. Like if you look at some of my original pixel art, it was really terrible. And just over the years, I've kind of figured out what I liked about stuff. And I did look at a lot of really good pixel art and go, how did they do this? How did they make this better than what I had? And use that to try and learn from.
So would you like reconstruct it, kind of like look at a picture side by side and kind of try to draw it yourself?
No, I didn't necessarily reconstruct other pieces of pixel art. Just be like, okay, well, let's see this eye that they did. How did they do that? Or this, I guess maybe I did. I did kind of reconstruct stuff. Now that I think about it, there were times where I'd look at something online that somebody else did and be like, how did they do this particular spot? And how can I do something similar and make it work? Right.
Right. Yes, because that sounds like a pretty good method to go about learning it. Would you recommend people learn kind of like what you said, the fundamentals of art, lighting and shading prior to doing pixel art, or do you think just diving straight in?
I personally think it's really important to learn the fundamentals first, because a lot of the time it's not only important to learn the fundamentals, but I think it's important to practice them. A lot of the time they'll start working on a piece of pixel art, right? And they'll spend 4 hours on this piece, and it'll be like a 128 by 128, like a massive pixel art piece that they're working on. They'll put all this detail and work into it. And in my opinion, if you're doing that to like create a piece of art that you want to share with somebody, that's good. But if you're trying to learn and practice, then I think that's bad. I think the approach that you take when you're learning and the approach that you take when you're creating is slightly different. It's similar to like learning on the piano, right? People who are learning to play the piano, they do a lot of scales. You're not going to go perform your scales for somebody else, right? That's not what you're doing. You're doing the scales to warm up your fingers, to get them used to the different key positions and key signatures, I mean. And so pixel art has that same thing, I think. And when you're learning, that you have your scales, which is just the fundamentals. You take very small canvas and focus on your light, your values, your shading, I guess your light, your values, and your edges and your shapes. Like, where's the light coming from? How does that affect your shapes? What colors are you going to be using? What values are you going to be using? And if you focus on those fundamentals and don't get too caught up in the details, then you can spend 3 hours doing like 20 small pieces, right? And really practice those areas and develop those areas. So that's kind of how I feel is a good way to learn pixel art.
That's actually pretty good. So like basically quantity over, I mean, it's not even quantity over quality. It's just quantity, and practicing the fundamentals is probably the most important.
Yeah, it's like focused quantity. And I do think that quality isn't like you're trying to get better as you're doing them. You're focusing on getting better, but you're not concerned as much with the details of the piece as you are with like the overall picture of the piece and the fundamentals. So yeah, quantity with a focus, with the right focus.
And so when it comes to games, like you're like, let's say you've learned pixel art good enough to kind of start moving on to putting into games. How big of a canvas would you use? Because in my mind, when I hear pixel art, I'm like, okay, like this is literally just like going to be a 32 by 32, just individual pixels poking kind of.
Yeah, it's the canvas size question is a common one too, and I think it's the reason it gets asked a lot is because there isn't like a single answer, right? You just tell people you're like, you just tell people that it depends, and of course people hate to hear that, right? But that is the answer. It depends. Like certain games, look at in particular, one that I can think of is, oh, what was that little game that was, you had a single area, you had a single arrow and you ran around in this world and fought bosses. It was a boss rush type game, and it was a pixel art.
Dang.
Titan Souls, I think, or Titan Soul, I think is what the game's called.
Okay.
So like you look at that game and the main character is tiny and they had a pretty big resolution for the screen. And why did they decide to do that? Well, it's because it's a boss rush game. So you get into these arenas and you have this giant, massive boss that you're fighting, and you're this tiny little guy. So they wanted the contrast there between the character on the screen and the boss that you were fighting. And that contrast was something that they were aiming for. So they chose a much smaller canvas size for their character. I don't know exactly what it is, but I bet it's under 24 pixels, maybe even like 16 pixels, like 20 by 16 or something. It's going to be a tiny one. And then these massive bosses that are probably like 64 by 64 or something, like a lot bigger than the character. But then you contrast that with like a Castlevania game, for example, Symphony of the Night or something, where the character is a much larger part of the screen. Your character takes up a big portion of your resolution, and the character is high fidelity and higher detail. And so, it depends on the kind of game that you're wanting to make. I do feel like generally the sizes range between like 16 by 16 and then like 64 by 64. Like they do go outside of that range in certain examples or certain cases, but a lot of the time they're inside of that range, and you kind of have to choose based on what the feeling you want your game to have.
Right. So you can basically put a good amount of detail in a 64 by 64 canvas. Because what is that?
Yeah.
That's like thousands of pixels. I mean, I can't do the math, but
yeah. It's a lot of pixels. And of course, that's something to consider too. Like, as you add more pixels, it takes more work. That's just how it is. Like the more pixels you have, the more work and time you're going to be spending on that character, because it gets exponentially more complicated. And so that's why I do recommend people learning to do pixel art, why they focus on smaller canvas sizes. And a lot of the time they're like, well, but I can't get the details in. And it's, you don't necessarily need those details yet. You're focusing on the fundamentals. And so don't worry about the details. They'll come later. Get your fundamentals down first.
Exactly. I think that's good to kind of start you need to start with like a strong foundation, as they say in every single thing that you do, every time someone tries to teach you something. So that's probably the best way to go. Have you ever delved into 3D, like Blender or anything like that?
I have done some 3D, and I would actually like to get into it at some point. I just haven't felt like I've reached that point yet, but I do really enjoy 3D modeling. I actually, in high school, my original plan was to be a draftsman that would make models for car parts, and so like I took computer-aided drafting in high school and made a lot of 3D models for like car parts. And that, funnily enough, that's actually what got me into game design, because the teacher was really unstructured in the way that he did his class. He gave you a bunch of assignments, and basically once you were done with those, you were guaranteed an A. Like you just had done all the assignments, and you could pick optional assignments and stuff to work on. But I was in that class when I actually discovered Game Maker. I had finished all of the other assignments. I was done with everything and had some extra time, and I just was poking around online curious about making games, and that's what got me into games in the first place. So I do have an interest in 3D modeling, and I'd like to get back into it in Blender.
That's pretty interesting. So in your school, did you had laptops and everything like that you were able to kind of poke around, or did you do it on the school computers?
I did it on the school computers. The teacher was just like that. He was cool. Like, as long as, I mean, he was there in the classroom with me when I was doing it. He didn't care. He was just like, as long as you weren't doing anything sketchy, then he was fine with you looking into different things and learning. I downloaded Game Maker onto the school computer.
That's insane.
I think, of course, the next day it was gone. Like, if I wanted to, like, I think I was saving my projects on like a jump drive and then re-downloading Game Maker every day to work on it. But the teacher was totally fine with it because I'd already done all the other work. He didn't care.
That's really cool. That's awesome. So kind of that teacher's kind of like your Robin Williams in in Dead Poet Society. He's your inspiration for basically your entire life. It seems like.
Yeah, he was a really good guy. I liked him a lot.
That's really cool. So basically, you started in high school, and then when did you decide to start a YouTube channel?
So I started my YouTube channel as a way to market my games. I knew that if I was going to make games and I was going to sell them, that I needed to be able to market them. And I was like, well, I can start a YouTube channel and make tutorial videos because I saw that other people were doing that. Sean Spalding. At the time, there was another creator called RM2K Dev. I'm pretty good friends with him. He doesn't really make stuff anymore online. But I saw that other creators were doing that. They were making tutorials and getting a lot of views on their videos. And I was like, this would be a good way to market my games. And it was actually right after, funnily enough, it was right after the Hyperlight Drifter Kickstarter. I saw Hyperlight Drifter, saw they were using Game Maker, and I was like, holy cow, I know how to use that program. And they raised $650,000. It's like some major survivorship bias going on there, but
Yeah.
I got interested in it, and again because of that, and started working on games, and I just realized that I was going to need a way to market, and that's what got me into YouTube. And YouTube was surprisingly really enjoyable for me. Like making tutorial videos, that's part of why I didn't really make any games for the first little while. Like the first commercial game I made some free games on the side, obviously, but the first commercial game I made was End Hall, and I released that like a couple years ago. So I just didn't really actually make any games because I was just enjoying making tutorials and teaching people so much, and that's where the money was coming from. I had my courses, and that was supporting me financially, and I was like, well, I'm just going to keep doing this. I like it. But then I kind of hit a point where I was like, okay, I actually still want to make games too.
Right.
So now I'm trying to kind of find the balance there.
I feel like my story is similar to yours. Of course, I'm 6 years behind you, but I was seeing like, okay, how can I make games and then get an audience? And it looked like tutorials were the way to go. But I also hit my tutorial burnout phase, I feel like, a little faster than you. If I'm gonna be honest, it was like I felt like that urge to make games so much that I was just stuck like I gave myself kind of a schedule where I'd be like, okay, this week I'm gonna do this week I'm gonna do this week I'm gonna do this. And it just kind of became like, this week I'm gonna make a tutorial, this week I'm gonna make a tutorial, this week I'm gonna make a tutorial. When do I make a game? And
Yeah.
I guess that you can call that imposter syndrome to an extent. Like, yeah, I mean, you're providing value with tutorials, but if I were to make a game, like how far would I really get making like my own game? That's not just a bunch of like studying. I mean, I guess it is making your own game in a way, but to me, I felt like, I don't know, I have this gnawing feeling in the back of my head that I just got to start making games.
Yeah, when you put something out there online and it's meant to be like you're telling people that they can learn from it, then you're a little bit more self-conscious, and people will point out the flaws in your tutorials and be like, look, you should have done this way, and that's a good thing. I think it's good that we're all learning, but there's kind of like this expectation around tutorials where it's like, well, how can you tell me how to make games if you don't actually make games, if you just make tutorials,
Right. And yeah. Go ahead.
that kind of feeling can come up, and I think I'm past that, but I definitely have felt that. Not completely past it. I think sometimes it still comes up, but for most of the time, I realize that my tutorial videos on YouTube are, like, they're a learning experience for me as much as they are for other people too. And as I learn, we're learning together, essentially. If somebody tells me, oh, you didn't do that right, we can do it this way, then in my next video, I can be like, hey guys, look, we did this wrong. I can heart their comment, so that other people will see it in the previous video. And then in the next video, I can be like, hey, so and so pointed out that there's this much better way to do this, and this is why. And we can kind of learn together as a community. And when I started adopting that kind of mentality, that was helpful to me.
Right. I think that's really useful. Like kind of the community, because you don't know everything. Like really, no one knows everything about it, and someone's gonna always find some kind of either more optimized or better way.
Yeah.
And I mean, as long as they're not a huge jerk about it, I mean, it should be pretty simple to implement.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
And there's
okay.
there's a I guess there's kind of like, now I forgot where I was going with this.
You're good.
Never mind.
Well, what I was gonna say is basically what I've kind of, I guess, as a New Year's resolution similar thing. I mean, I don't know if I call it that, I probably won't follow it. But basically, I decided that instead of making tutorials for full games, I was going to do this game jam where I make a game every month in different genres. And then when I hit some kind of new concept or something that I really didn't understand that well, I'll basically learn about it during this game jam and then make a tutorial, which is what I intend to do with networking, even though I feel like I have very fundamental and rudimentary like knowledge of it now at this point.
Yeah.
I feel like I can at least kind of teach the basics, and that what that really does is kind of explain it to myself and kind of try to cement some of the knowledge.
Yeah, and you're just sharing what you learned, right? You're like, hey, I think that's the fun part of making tutorials, where it's like getting on and you're not necessarily like, this is the way to do stuff. You're getting on and you're like, hey, look what I found, look what I learned. I thought this was interesting, and I wanted to share it with everyone. And I think it takes courage to do that, to be able to post something that you have learned, even if it might not be like the optimal way that like the masters of networking out there would recommend to do stuff, but to say, look, this is what I learned. This might help you understand these things better, and get you interested in this. And I think I feel like that's kind of my role as a tutorial creator, is more to get people interested and excited about learning these things, instead of like giving them the best. Sometimes the best methods are kind of dry and a little bit boring, and it's not as much fun. and those methods are oftentimes solutions to problems that many beginners don't even have yet. and and I feel like when you're learning, the solutions that stick with you are the ones that you have problems for. Like, I have this problem, okay, here's a solution. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's really helpful. Whereas, like, if you don't have a problem and then you're like, here's the optimal way of doing things, you're going to be like, well, why do I need to do it that way? You know?
Right. And even on top of that, like everyone wishes that there was a tutorial for every single thing that they searched. But I think the learning comes from when you have kind of two adjacent things that you have to mix together or kind of like fill in the gaps. So having this optimal solution for everything might not be the best way to learn and kind of make your own game. Yeah, you can make the same game as the tutorial, but how much further can you go from that, I think?
Yeah, having kind of like a let's explore this and let's experiment with this mentality, I think is good, especially when new developers sit down to code and they look at that blank page and they go, well, I don't know how to do these things. I don't know what the best way to do these things is. And I think when you're learning, it's better to go, well, how can I do this? How can I make this work? Even if it's not the best way, even if I do it totally wrong and crash and burn, you know, uh, have the courage to start putting some code down and seeing where things go and how it's going to work. And that's the best way to learn how to program, I think.
Yeah, one time I had this, I was trying to make like a Minesweeper kind of clone, and something happened where like when I would click on the mine, like a block, I would run like this. I accidentally caused myself to have. I would basically run a check on each block to see if it's a bomb or not, and I would basically cause this infinite loop that crashed my game. And I'm just like bringing this up because that's the kind of stuff that you get when you try to do things on your own. But now I know basically ways to kind of avoid infinite loops, or kind of like I've kind of cemented in my mind ways to like kind of stop conditional statements if it's not true or if it's not like necessary to run again.
Yeah, I think the best practices are super important, but they're well, and when I say best practices, I mean best methods. I should say best practices might be a different thing, and that it's like, make sure you're putting
Right.
comments in your code and doing these
Indents
things
or whatever.
Yeah, but the best methods for like best algorithms out there, those are definitely for the more experienced users, and beginners I don't think should concern themselves as much with like the optimal algorithm as much as they should with like making sure they're writing clean code and commenting their code, and having good function names and learning those sorts of best practices, but then just experimenting with their code as much as they can to try and learn.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's like this space in YouTube where it seems like there are a few advanced tutorials, but I'm wondering if the reason that there's no advanced tutorials is because people who are, I guess, considered advanced have this problem-solving skill that kind of have kind of surpassed that. But I feel like there is kind of room for like, I guess you wouldn't call it advanced, intermediate tutorials where like people have kind of understood arrays and understood how to implement those into games. I think there's kind of a space for that. I'm just having trouble figuring out what would be considered intermediate. I feel like I might start kind of, because I don't know.
Yeah, I think the intermediate, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately too. My thoughts on it are long form tutorials are really good for beginners, and then quicker tutorials are better for intermediate users, where it's like you're not explaining every little line you put in the code. You're just like, here's the method in which I did this,
Right.
And unfortunately, there's not like a good, at least that I know of, there's not like a good place out there for written tutorials. Maybe GitHub would be a good place for that, where you have the source code and then you have like a written tutorial down below. And I feel like the video format is really good for beginners, but video format starts to fall short when you're an intermediate or advanced user, because there's just too much fluff in the video that's not helpful to you. And I feel like Mrs. is a good example. He's another tutorial creator that I mentioned earlier. I feel like he's kind of figured out that intermediate tutorial level where it's like, I'm expecting that you know the basics of programming here, and I'm just going to give you my method in really short, quick,
Right, he does those 1 minute, 2 minute tutorials or whatever, like the.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that he's appealing to kind of that market that you're talking about, where it's like they already know the basics. They don't want to go through a long form, 3-hour tutorial series with 27 videos or whatever it is. They just want, how do I do this thing really quick? And he's giving it to him. And I think there is a market there, like you were saying.
Yeah, and actually, when you talked about the like, I always find myself watching the videos at 2 times speed and skipping through and probably missing some stuff. But I think the image and text-based tutorials actually do have a space. I don't know. I feel like the best way to do it would probably be hosting on like a static website or something yourself. But
yeah, the problem is, this has been the problem with written tutorials for a while, I think, and GitHub might be the solution to this, but people don't go. GitHub doesn't feel like the solution. The problem is people don't go to. First of all, it takes a lot of work to make a written tutorial and a video tutorial.
Right.
And then you're kind of targeting different audiences at that point, right? But people don't go to GitHub to search for tutorials, at least that I know of, right? People go to YouTube. They're like, how do I do this thing? They go into YouTube and they search it.
Right.
And so in order to get visibility on your tutorial, it almost feels like you have to make it a video. And because that's where people go, that's where the audience is going to find tutorials. But if there was a space out there that people were like, how do I do this? I am an intermediate creator. I don't need to go watch a tutorial video on YouTube. I want something written. Where can I go to search for that? I feel like there's something missing there, and that's part of the reason written tutorials haven't taken off. I think they could if they had the same discoverability as video tutorials.
I think the question comes in, how many people are, because, I feel like a lot of people talk about Stack Overflow. So if you could somehow pop up on that list where Stack Overflow is from Google, so obviously if they searched it on Google, you'd want to be number one on that list somehow. But I think that's really your best bet, if at all, if you're trying to make written tutorials. I do think that would be, I feel like, enormously helpful if written tutorials existed as a kind of an optional thing, because the speed that you can get stuff done would just increase exponentially, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a problem there that hasn't been solved, and I don't know what the solution is, but I definitely think that written tutorials are highly valuable, but aren't being discovered. Like, there's not a good way to get access to them and find them that people are using.
Right. I think, yeah, I agree with you. So kind of moving back onto your game, Demonlocke, and balancing it with your YouTube channel, how much time would you say you spend on the actual game itself during the week?
It varies from week to week, obviously. Like the last little while, I've been focusing on a new YouTube series, so the amount of time I've been working on Demonlocke has gone way down. Whereas before, I was doing probably like 4 days a week on Demonlocke, 1 day a week on YouTube, and obviously, with my courses, I do basically daily Discord support where I answer questions in my Discord for courses. But since I'm doing it every day, it's not too hard to keep up on that. And I have other students who help answer questions as well that I really appreciate. That helps a lot. But yeah, like, I think my ideal balance would be 4 days a week working on the game, 1 day a week working on YouTube, course maintenance, and stuff like that, while doing Discord support throughout the week. That would be kind of like my ideal balance. But
how many hours
sometimes
do you do?
Sorry, what?
How many hours per day?
I usually get about 8 hours in a day. I mean, this is my full-time job, so I don't track my hours, but it's
Right.
usually about normal. I get up, I start working around 8 and then get off around 5. I come out for little breaks in between to get food and stuff, but it's usually pretty consistent, 8-hour work days.
That's pretty cool. That's nice. That's nice to keep structured and organized. It probably helps a lot.
Yeah, since I have a family, I think that makes it easier for me to stay structured, right? It's like the evenings or time that I spend with my family, and that helps keep me from getting too crazy with work stuff too. I think if it was just me and my partner, right, we would probably I mean, it was when I first started my channel, and I think I just worked a lot more back then too because I didn't have kids yet. It was just like my schedule was crazy. It wasn't quite the same. But as I've had kids and my family life has stabilized in that way, I've kind of structured my work life better as well. It's kind of encouraged me to do that.
I think it's really important to have the structure. Yeah, I'm trying to, like, that's why I'm asking about this is yeah, kind of for the podcast, but at the same time, like, I'm trying to figure out like a good method from someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Because yeah, at this point I can have this be a full-time or basically a part-time job, but I want to be able to structure it the right way where I get the optimal kind of return on quality and content and making the games kind of.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so you said your brother kind of hopped off of Demonlocke. Is he going to, I mean, I don't know if you say he's not really a game developer per se, but would he be going on his own project or?
So he is likely going, at some point he's likely going to be coming back and working on it again, depending on circumstances and stuff. He moved away, so he's not living around here anymore, and that's part of why he's not working on the project anymore. Because he would actually just come over, and like, I have a table set up in here, and he would just work next to me in this room here. And so, but at some point he might come back to the project as well. Obviously, I don't know exactly what his plans are going to be.
Right.
He's got his own plans, and they might change. But last when I was talking with him, which was last that I talked with him about Demonlocke and stuff, which is a few weeks ago, I think. He was still interested in coming back eventually and working on it and making games with me kind of full time. Like the future that we both kind of envisioned was that we both end up working together on games kind of as partners and trying to split the responsibilities pretty evenly. Maybe having a few contract workers for sound effects and sprites and stuff, areas where we feel like we could use some support in those areas, but kind of having it be the dynamic duo, the two of us working together on games. We've always been pretty close. He's my youngest brother. Actually, I have two other brothers in between, and but we're kind of the most similar, I think, in personality, and so we're pretty good friends, and that would be kind of an ideal scenario. But he's also really interested in music and philosophy and other areas that, who knows, maybe he'll end up deciding to go those routes.
Right.
You know, he's still young. He's like 20, so 19 or 20 now, and so he's not like my path is set in life, right? I already know that I want to do games, and I'm pretty committed to this path. But
yeah, and you kind of have it. You kind of have it settled as well, a little bit. Like, I wouldn't say relaxed, but you have kind of a groove that you're in. So.
Yeah, exactly. And he hasn't figured out his groove yet, and so he's still working on that.
So how has development kind of? I'm not trying to keep this negative, but how has it kind of suffered since he's left?
Yeah, it's been harder, definitely. The two main reasons why I think it's harder. Number one, he left, so then I was doing everything, and some stuff just kind of falls off. Like the marketing has been, obviously I'm doing devlogs still, but it's like every couple of months instead of every week, like what we were doing before. We could squeeze it in, and also he did finish up the music, so I pretty much have the soundtrack, so that's nice. But there's still all the audio work and stuff,
Right.
the sound effects, and I have to manage the Trello now. I have to try and manage the marketing, and he was actually pretty good at marketing too, so that was useful. So it suffered in that way. The second way that it suffered has been the fact that I just scaled the project up. Like our original scope was quite a bit smaller, and then we got the feedback, and I was like, okay, well, what can we do to make this amazing? And I think I scaled up too much. I added a little too much. I think there were some really good changes. Ironically, I didn't scale it up as big as I wanted to, which, doesn't make this scale all better. It just means it could have been a bigger disaster in terms of scope.
I'm sure it'll work out. I mean, it'll just take more time, and it seems, I saw your video on kind of how to overcome that dread, I guess what you call it, to go to work or on the game.
Yeah, like when you're just not motivated, you don't want to work.
Yeah, forming the habit of really anything that has to do with I think I've seen a similar concept of you don't want to go outside for a walk or a run, then just go outside for 2 minutes. Anyone can do anything for 2 minutes. It's kind of a similar concept that you have there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, reinforcing the habit. I've come up with this theory that is what I call the minimum amount of conscious effort, which is in any task there's a portion of effort that you can do non-consciously. You don't even have to think about it, right? You just do it automatically. And when you're trying to develop a skill and a habit, you want to do the minimum amount of conscious effort, which is just like what is enough that pushes me just enough to stay challenged so I don't get bored, but not so much that I get overwhelmed with everything that I'm trying to do. And I think most people push themselves too much. They're like, oh, this year I want to lose weight, so I'm going to start jogging 2 miles every day. And they haven't jogged in years consistently. Right. And their first goal is to jog 2 miles every day, and they burn themselves out, Like I started jogging in October, I think, or August, somewhere around there, September, somewhere around in there. And I went down there and I didn't push myself at all. Like I was just like, I'm just forming the habit. I'm not even gonna, because the minimum amount of conscious effort at that point was actually just getting on the treadmill every day. That took conscious effort, right? And so as long as I was reinforcing that, but then at some point that becomes non-conscious. All of a sudden you realize you're just getting on the treadmill every day without thinking about it. And that's the point where you start to add a little bit,
So you've got this psychological element on top of what you got. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, it is psychological. Our brains, they look at a task and they judge based on how hard it was. They judge whether or not they want to do it again. They're oh man, that thing was really hard. I do not want to do that again. And it makes it really hard to do it again. So if you don't push yourself too much, if you just establish it, then eventually it's going to become a habit, and it's going to become the easiest route is actually, you're kind of like making a groove down the hill as water. And the easiest route is going to become getting on the treadmill every day. And once that becomes easy, you don't have to think about it anymore. Then you start pushing yourself a little bit more. And so you're always focusing on what's the minimum amount of conscious effort. You want to make it the minimum. It still has to be conscious. You still have to push yourself, but it's just the minimum.
Right. And I think a lot of times the minimum, at least at the start of things, is literally that I don't want to do it, but I have to do it. I'm going to do it. That's it.
It is.
Yeah,
that is the minimum. When you're working on a game, the minimum is I don't want to work on my game today. I just don't feel like working on it. And in that moment, you have to realize that, okay, well, even if I just open up the project and run it, which is what I talked about in my tweet thread, right? Then I'm overcoming that minimum, and I'm making that a habit and making it so that one day I will just open it up and run it without even thinking about it. And at that point, I can do more.
Right. Kind of establish a new minimum. But it really is as simple. It seems the way you say it, and I'm sure it's as simple as it sounds, is literally just, just kind of hit that first barrier. As soon as you hit that first barrier, move on past it a little bit, and then you're kind of done for the day, as if you want to be. But a lot of times you find that you're going to continue on a little bit. Would you say stop yourself? Because you're saying when it, like, let's say the jogger, let's use the analogy of the jogger again. He wants to go out for a jog, and all of a sudden it's really easy. And then now he decides, okay, I'm going to go 2 miles. No, is that the wrong way to go about it?
Yeah. So this is the hardest part. It's easier, I think, with game development because a lot of the time the hardest thing is just starting. But with jogging, there's another element. And there's a really, really fine balance between pushing yourself a little bit and not pushing yourself too much. And that balance is different for different people. Some people, they have maybe a higher tolerance for it and they can push themselves a little bit more than others. I have found that I'm the kind of person that doesn't have a very high tolerance. I have to, like for me right now with jogging, I will start, I walk, jog. So I'll walk and jog and walk and jog. And at the times where I'm jogging, the amount that I found that works for me is about the point where I start to feel like I'm getting winded and can't breathe. And then I go back to walking. I've had days where I've pushed through that and just kind of forced myself, and then I feel kind of yucky afterwards. And I look back on it and think that was probably too much for me. And this is for establishing long-term habits that you want to have for your whole life. This isn't like a training.
Right. If you want to go jog a marathon, or something. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to go jog a marathon, you're probably going to have to kill yourself a little bit. And that's just part of how it works, at first. But if you want to establish a long-term habit that you're going to have your whole life, and maybe by the end of your life, you will be jogging marathons and it won't be hard, then this is the way to go. And it's just, I have seen improvement in my exercise with jogging, but it's been very gradual. So you do have to stop yourself. That was your question, right?
Right. And even with programming, it's probably a similar thing. Like you find yourself opening up something and you're working on how to make this mechanic work, or it involves some kind of a complicated algorithm. I feel like if you're doing that every day and you just can't figure it out, or you're having trouble finding the resources for it, I mean, I think that would be that would be the time that you're winded in a sense.
Yeah, there's you kind of hit a wall, right? You hit a wall with your programming, and I think that sometimes just taking a break can be really helpful for that, and sometimes you need outside help with programming, where it's like, this thing that I'm trying to do is too much for me, and you either need to cut it from your project or get outside help in order to complete that, because if you hit that wall too many times, you're going to completely burn out, and then you'll just want to drop it. And I do think that there are times when you have to go to somebody who's more experienced and say, "Hey, look, I can't figure this out. Can you at least point me in the right direction?" Like online, if you point me in the direction of how to solve this problem, then that might really help me. And taking breaks from the problem helps too sometimes, where you can solve it. You've just been working on it for 4 hours straight,
Right.
and you need some sleep,
Right. A lot of times it's a simpler solution than the way, like, your mind has been working in overdrive this whole time. Sometimes you complicate things more than it needs to be complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you want outside help. How do you find a person that would be willing? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of these people, they don't have a lot of support, people watching. How would they go about finding kind of I would say a mentor or a kind of programming helper?
Yeah, I guess I have used mainly YouTube tutorials and Google for that kind of outside help. And if I couldn't find it there, then I sort of dropped it, because a lot of the time the solutions are out there, but if you can't understand them well enough, then the problem might be outside of your current minimum amount of conscious effort. You might be taking on more than you can chew right now, and you have to realize that patience is the most important skill for developing a new skill. And sometimes patience means realizing that you're a beginner and that you can't make an MMO, and that you need to focus on what you can do, right? And focus on those parts of making a game, the parts that you can understand, focus on the kinds of games that you can make, and slowly increase from there and add on to that.
Yeah. I really like how this came full circle, from the pixel art to this is almost the exact same concept. So it's really, this has been an amazing podcast.
Thanks.
Yeah. So guys, check out HeartBeast on YouTube. It's youtube.com/uheartbeast, letter U.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got Demonlocke in progress. I'm sure the alpha's out there. Another alpha is scheduled to come out in the next couple months, right?
Yep.
And
yeah, we'll see. I
right.
don't have an exact date for that yet.
Right. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, thanks for having me. It's been a really fun podcast. It's been good questions and made me think about some things, and I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, man. It was awesome.